creating differences between communities of the oppressed is the best way to make revolution impossible.
You're listening to Queering Premodern Asia, a limited series and season 5 of the Nuances podcast. This narrative series features stories and discussions with queer Asian co-hosts and scholars about queerness, love, and premodern life in Asia. I'm your host and producer, Lazu. I'm a cis-straight Chinese-American woman who spent the last year, it's already been a year, researching and developing this series. I'm excited to be joined by my co-host for today, Stella.
Hello, my name is Stella. I'm a queer Korean American and I co-host the Brazn Azn podcast with the lovely Virginia Duan, also known as the Mandarin Mama. I'm here today to talk about the impacts of imperialism on queer and trans identities.
For transcripts, show notes, and more ways to listen and support, go to nuancespod.com. You can also follow us on all social media at nuancespod. Content warning, this limited series explores historical contexts of love, gender, sexuality, and cultural norms. Exploration of those themes should not be deemed as an endorsement of those practices. It was a different time with different norms. This information is for entertainment purposes only. Mature themes may be explored. Today's episode includes mention of colonial violence, religious indoctrination, religious trauma, as well as racist, sexist, and homophobic tropes. Listener discretion is advised. Now enjoy the show. This episode has taken me so long to put together because there is so much to cover. In the end, I feel like it would be better if I split it into 2 parts. So this is the first part where we're going to focus on countries that were directly colonized by the West. And in the second part, we're going to talk about countries that were not directly colonized, but were still influenced by the West's presence in Asia in certain ways. So here is part 1 of the West, Savior or Demonizer. People have asked me why I chose to focus on pre-modern Asia for this series. In modern times, many of our cultures are assumed to be conservative compared to the West, especially when it comes to sexuality. And to some extent, it is assumed that it's always been this way and that sexual liberation and queerness are Western inventions. But pre-modern times across Asia paint a very different and often surprising picture. So far in this series, we've touched on female agency and very liberal attitudes towards sex in Vietnam and most of Southeast Asia, and even in Japan, Korea, and China. We learned about third gender priests or shamans holding high status in societies from the Mughal Empire in present-day Pakistan to Indonesia. Then we have the very overt male-male love documented in Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese histories. Female-female dildos marketed to women in Japan, women-only communes in China, cross-dressing people across the Asian continent, and there are still more stories to come in this series. But at this point, you might be wondering, what happened? Why did it all change? This was the central question that led me to create this series in the first place. To understand how we got here, I thought it would be helpful to know where we were in pre-modern times. Spoiler alert, Jesus wasn't white. To be fair, there were many imperial powers throughout Asia conquering lands, making deals, and subjugating people. The Mongol Empire, for example, was the largest contiguous empire in history, ever. It was 9.27 million square miles. For reference, the US is 3.797 million square miles. So it was about 2.5 times the size of the entire US. Even the weapons trade started in Asia. After China developed gunpowder and the first firearms in the 10th century, the Ottomans, Safavid, and Mughal empires adopted gunpowder artillery from the 14th century onward. Korea also started using Chinese and local firearms in the late 14th century. Vietnam also adopted firearms at some point during its march to the south from the 11th to the 19th century, conquering the Champa Kingdom. In other words, we've been fighting each other for centuries, actually even millennia. The Indus River civilization in South Asia, which lasted from 2300 to 1750 BCE, was destroyed partly by climate, but partly also by invasion from non-Indus people. That was way before Alexander the Great's invasion in 326 BCE. Various invasions from Central Asia and West Asia take place before the Portuguese traders reach India in 1498, promptly followed by the Dutch, British, and French. Colonialism was bad, for sure, But we're not giving white people credit for inventing it, only for perfecting it, maybe. Here is Professor Anjali Arondekar from UC Santa Cruz explaining how colonialism wasn't equally bad for everyone.
Colonialism makes a difference, but it makes a difference in very different ways, right? Colonialism creates bridges, education, all kinds of apparatuses, but it also creates inequities. Their policy was divide and rule. Whatever divided, we will use. But for certain communities, caste oppressed communities, right? Dalit or Bahujan, those are the two terms we use. Dalit is the term that people prefer instead of untouchable or Harijan, and Bahujan literally means the many, which refers to caste oppressed peoples in general. For some of them, colonialism was not a good thing, but it was not a bad thing because the colonial state did not necessarily discriminate on the basis of caste. They just bunched everyone together. Yes, colonialism is bad, but there was greed before colonialism arrived. So it's not as if brown people were not oppressing each other before the white man came around.
So why did white people want to go to Asia anyway? It all starts with trade. We Asians had the good stuff. Spices, tea, porcelain, silk, paper, gunpowder, dyes, perfumes, you name it, we had it. The West had useful things too. Wool, camels, honey, wine, silver, other metals. All these goods were traded back and forth along the Silk Road, which was 4,000 miles long or 6,400 kilometers. It stretched from modern-day Istanbul and Cairo to Beijing and Hangzhou. The Silk Road was not actually a fixed road, but more a general route across the Eurasian continent. It was mostly used from the 2nd century BCE to the mid-15th century. People would rarely go across the entire road, though. Usually merchants would go back and forth between smaller segments and trade that way, which is much more efficient. If a route can be used to sell goods, it can be used to sell ideas too. The network facilitated exchanges of religious, philosophical, and scientific thought, leading to syncretism along the way. Oh, and diseases, like the plague. Oh, and technology, like gunpowder and pew-pew and kaboom. From 1453 onwards, the Ottoman Empire began competing with other gunpowder empires, the Safavid and Mughal empires, for greater control over these land routes. This prompted the Europeans to seek other ways to get their goods. Thus starts the age of discovery and European colonialism. The Portuguese were the first to sail around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. They ended up colonizing parts of current-day Indonesia, Malaysia, China, and India. The French colonized current-day Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and also part of China and India. The Spanish colonized the Philippines. The Dutch colonized Indonesia, Borneo, and had outposts in current-day Iran, Bangladesh, Thailand, China, Taiwan, and India. Other European countries had a presence in Asia as well, including Germany, Denmark, and Sweden. One of the ways in which colonizers rationalize their violence is by telling themselves that they're helping the people they colonize, or that it's mutually beneficial somehow. Sometimes this help is in military form. You find two sides fighting each other, you pick the one that's more likely to become your puppet, arm that side, help them win, and then they're beholden to you, and you get what you want. Sometimes the help is in the form of Western medicine, education, technology, and such, which helps the elite maintain their upper hand. Sometimes this help is for the next life, in order to save their souls in the name of Jesus Christ and to teach them morality. Or in its more secular version, this help is sometimes to civilize the occupied population. In this scenario, local religions are demonized, shamans are forced to convert or even executed, laws are passed to criminalize certain rituals or cultural norms that up until now no one had a problem with, like, gay sex, cross-dressing, just standing around, aka loitering. Many of the colonies implemented laws that regulated sexuality, but none had as big an impact on the global scale as the British one. To give you an idea of just how vast the impact of colonialism can be on culture, I need to introduce you to Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, introduced by the British Empire in 1860. It reads as follows.
Section 377. Unnatural offences. Whoever voluntarily has carnal intercourse against the order of nature with any man, woman, or animal shall be punished with imprisonment for life, or with imprisonment for a term which may extend to 10 years, and shall be liable to fine. Explanation. Penetration is sufficient to constitute the carnal intercourse necessary to the offence described in this section.
At the time, the British law system was still not quite modernized. The Indian Penal Code was developed and basically beta tested in the Indian colony first because imperial rule is authoritarian, and they could impose this cultural shift there without the public backlash and heated debates that they'd get at home if they tried the same thing. Once the Indian Penal Code was established in India, its framework was quickly exported back to the homeland in 1861. It's worth noting that the work on regulating sexuality in the colony began way earlier in 1825, and the first draft was introduced in 1837. But the Indians resisted, and the Brits were so prude they were hesitant to even talk about it. The main author of this draft, Thomas Babington Macaulay, didn't even dare to say what was in this section when he first introduced it in a speech in 1837. He said,
Clause 361 and 362 relate to an odious class of offences respecting which it is desirable that as little as possible should be said. We are unwilling to insert, either in the text or in the notes, anything which could give rise to public discussion on this revolting subject, as we are decidedly of opinion that the injury which would be done to the morals of the community by such discussion would far more than compensate for any benefits which might be derived from legislative measures framed with the greatest precision.
On one hand, they felt it was imperative to change the native culture to civilize them. On the other, they were worried that male colonizers, especially the ones who didn't have a wife with them in the colony, would resort to homosexuality because it was hot. I mean, literally hot. They actually thought homosexuality was something that was far more common for countries between the latitudes of 43 degrees north and 30 degrees south. Doesn't it strike you that it wasn't a symmetrical range like 30 north and 30 south or 45 north and 45 south? Yeah, me too. I mean, 43 is very specific. Well, if we look at it on a map in Europe, Britain's southern tip is around 50 north, so they're way above this parallel. Below the 43rd parallel are parts of southern France, Italy, and Greece. Some European rivalry there? Maybe. Not sure. But that's not the most interesting part. It conveniently cuts off all of Africa, the so-called Middle East, and most of Asia from China down. The 30 south is less interesting because there aren't that many countries below the 30th parallel south, you know? Anyway. Inculcating European morality into the resistant masses, who they deemed too lenient against perverse sex, was apparently a pressing matter. In a gist, the vicious natives needed to be civilized, policed, kept subjected, segregated from the virtuous whites to prevent the white colonizers from forgetting their European morality. Sounds to me like a bunch of white dudes found out they liked men, and it freaked out some other white dudes in charge. Section 377 was the first colonial sodomy law integrated into the Penal Code, and it became a model for anti-sodomy laws in almost every country that ever flew the British imperial flag. For most of history, queerness was not part of someone's identity. This likely started changing with vagrancy laws. A vagrancy law targets people deemed as wandering, loitering without purpose. This was to get rid of undesirable people from the public areas. It was more about who they were than what they were doing or not doing. Not any loiterer would be targeted. Usually it's migrant laborers, poor people, homeless people, beggars, travelers, street kids. A 1572 act required rogues, vagabonds, or sturdy beggars to be grievously whipped and burnt through the gristle of the right ear with a hot iron. That's in England. The UK's 1824 Vagrancy Act systematized both classification and punishment of undesirables for a bourgeois age. Anyone begging or sleeping out or appearing to engage in prostitution or acts associated with a, quote, disreputable mode of life, unquote, would be convicted as idle and disorderly and sentenced to 2 weeks hard labor. Multiple convictions or conspicuous poverty would downgrade you to rogue and vagabond or an incorrigible rogue. This law was a model that was exported throughout the British colonies as well. These laws gave the police a lot of power to punish almost any behavior or people they want. Sexual misconduct and sexualized identities were often targets. This was all part of the quote, civilizing mission, unquote. In 1899, the Sudanese Penal Code created a new identity within the habitual vagabond, and that is the catamite, described as any male person who dresses or is attired in a fashion of a woman in a public space, or practices sodomy as a means of livelihood or as a profession. They didn't have to be caught doing anything. Just their clothes were enough evidence to arrest them. In Europe, vagrancy laws mostly targeted poor people. It wasn't about race. It was about class. But in the colonies, everything was about race. These laws were to control the natives, the non-whites. In India, entire tribes were automatically categorized as innately criminal with the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871. They believed that nomadic tribes were addicted to crime and sexually immoral. If you were part of those tribes, you had to register with the authorities or you could be prosecuted. Sounds like the Muslim registry that Trump wanted. Once registered, you weren't allowed to move freely beyond authorized areas. In 1897, the empire amended the Criminal Tribes Act to include a category of eunuchs, defined as all members of the male sex who admit themselves or upon medical inspection clearly appear to be impotent. In practice, this was targeting hijras. In episode 3, we talked about hijras who are considered a third gender category in India. Under this statute, any eunuch who dressed or ornamented like a woman in a public street, or dances, plays music, or takes part in any public exhibition in a public street, could be arrested without warrant and imprisoned for up to 2 years. They were denied legal personhood. They could not draw up a will or adopt children. The authorities kept a register of all eunuchs reasonably suspected of committing offenses under Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code. Again, these laws allowed the state to arrest people on the presumption of sodomy without any proof of an actual act. Just looking like the type was enough to be harassed, arrested, detained, and abused. Not to mention the part about upon inspection. Indeed, there were inspections. I will spare you the details here. Go read the whole Human Rights Watch report in the show notes, but suffice it to say that hijras and female prostitutes alike were subjected to invasive medical exams, and any venereal disease was sure to be taken as proof that they committed crimes and should be jailed. During this time, forensic doctors like Auguste Ambroise Tardieu in France and John Glaster in Britain came up with very scientific ways to be homophobes. Their tests for sodomy by looking at someone's butts were the 19th century version of the Theranos blood tests. Complete bullshit. Modern medicine says so now. But just like with Theranos, everyone bought it at the time. From India to Egypt to Zimbabwe, the privacy of people was violated in carceral conditions. Indian forensic experts who had bought into this nonsense did the model minority thing and followed the footsteps of Tardieu and Glaster, adding new parameters that supposedly make the catamite or sodomite's body as a scientifically, physically distinct type of person. It was also worth noting that in all the laws that condemned, quote, unnatural offenses, unquote, consent was never taken into account. This meant that someone abusing a minor or someone who raped a partner was lumped into the same category as someone who had consensual same-sex intercourse. This is crucial in creating legal stigma and associating same-sex relations with pedophilia and sexual assault. In contrast with this, here's what Professor CunCun Wu from the University of Hong Kong said about the laws in China before modernization.
Throughout more than 2,000 years in Chinese history, we don't have any single law just to pick up the same-sex relationship. In Chinese history, if like anything involved same-sex rape or sexual harassment, usually the law document will always say treated as heterosexual rape or heterosexual harassment, this kind of word. So it's very, very different. The historical background is totally different.
Today, more than 80 countries still criminalize consensual homosexual conduct between adult men and sometimes between adult women too. Over half of those countries have these laws because they were British colonies once. In Asia and the Pacific, countries that inherited those laws included Australia, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Brunei, Fiji, Hong Kong, India, Kiribati, Malaysia, Maldives, Marshall Islands, Myanmar, Nauru, New Zealand, Pakistan, Papua New Guinea, Singapore, Solomon Islands, Sri Lanka, Tonga, Tuvalu, and Western Samoa. In Africa, countries that inherited this code are Botswana, Gambia, Ghana, Kenya, Lesotho, Malawi, Mauritius, Nigeria, Seychelles, Sierra Leone, Somalia, Swaziland, Sudan, Tanzania, Uganda, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. Of all those countries I've listed, New Zealand, Australia, Hong Kong, Fiji, Lesotho, Botswana, and Mauritius have struck down the law. By the way, in Palestine, the law is from the British Mandate Criminal Code Ordinance number 74 of 1936, section 152(2). It condemns carnal knowledge against the order of nature with a prison sentence of up to 10 years. So next time you hear someone make some comment about how anti-queer Palestine is, implying how homophobic Muslims and Arabs are, remember that the Brits are at least partly responsible for the homophobia that exists in this region of the world. Keeping in mind all these laws in British colonial India, I asked Professor Arondekar about Portuguese India and the difference in how sexuality was regulated there versus in British colonial India.
The British were obsessed with taxonomy. The details with which they wrote things is maddening. The British loved to record everything. They recorded, tried to map, manage all kinds of things, whereas the Portuguese were a little bit lazy. And also the empire was bumbling around by the time the British reached ascension. The scale of the British Empire in the 19th century is massive compared to the Portuguese, Spanish, French, etc. Because of that, the scale of intervention into people's intimate lives was very different. So the British had a bazillion laws about when you could marry, who you could marry, around regions, castes, etc., where the Portuguese kind of left you alone. In Portuguese India, because of the longevity of the empire and because the territory was much smaller, they were less invested in management of sexuality until maybe the early 20th century. Before that, there was a massive investment in converting people to Christianity, but less interest in the daily rituals and practices, etc. They were sort of left alone. The other important distinction was that the British were not settlers in India. They were not interested in remaining in India. If you are planning to settle, the policing around intermarriage, around intimacy between races becomes a little bit more fluid, as we see in other places. But in British colonial India, the regimentation of contact between the races was very, very important. So if you look at Portuguese India, you see lots of examples of mixed children, of people having relationships with women. You don't see as much of that in British India in any open way. So the difference between settler and non-settler is very, very important.
Before the Spanish invasion, Filipinos lived in communities called barangay. Land was communal. The datus, or village chiefs, were mere administrators. Society was pretty egalitarian, with women and men having the same inheritance rights and level of respect. And when a woman inherited property from her parents, her husband had no rights to it. There were even many formidable female leaders, and the archipelago was known as the Queen Country of ancient Asia. Enter the Spaniards. Remember, everyone wanted access to precious goods from China. Competing with the Portuguese who had settled in Macau, the Spaniards sailed from what is now Mexico and made Manila their main trading hub with China, where they would buy all sorts of Chinese goods in exchange for silver coins minted in the Americas. The prevailing Spanish culture at the time was steeped in Christian patriarchy. Men had all the power and women were subservient to them. So imagine their horror when they land in Manila and find women here are far from docile properties of their husbands. No, the indigenous Filipino women were literate, they were traders, shared equal responsibilities, and had equal say in the household, and would demand that their husbands wear bling-blings on their in order to pleasure them. Their arms were covered in tattoos. that was seen as a sign of beauty. Men and women were understood to be equally important in maintaining harmony in the world, as embodied by Lakapati, the hermaphrodite goddess we talked about in the previous episode. You can imagine how much the missionaries freaked out about these powerful women. But it gets better, or worse if you're the missionaries. Religious rituals called Maganito were led by Babaylans who were mostly women. Women priests? Outrageous. But wait, it gets better, or worse if you're the missionaries. Some of these Babaylans aren't women, but men who look like women, live like women, and marry other men like women. At this point, I would like to imagine that the missionaries pulling his hair, rubbing his eyes, pacing back and forth like he's being chased by Satan, dripping sweat in this tropical weather, while the locals eat mangoes and laugh as they watch him in bemusement. Alas, this is only my fantasy. They certainly did freak out, but it wasn't funny at all. If you're a Franciscan or Dominican Catholic missionary, you see anything that isn't in service of the Christian God and worshiping Jesus as evil and the work of demons. Whether in the Americas or in Southeast Asia, the approach is the same sales pitch. The Christian God is the only true God. You have to worship him and his son Jesus Christ, and if you don't, your soul will burn eternally in the fires of hell. You have to convert now so your soul can be saved. Of course, they declared the male Babaylans as immoral sodomites, and the female ones? Well, of course, they're witches. Their ritual performances were described as witchcraft or deceits for the purpose of emptying the pockets of ignorant people. The Maganito, which is a religious ceremony, including prayers, dances, songs, and feasting to appease the spirits, was described as a hoax, an excuse, and an incitement to drink. In a very detailed list, the Franciscan friar described 10 different types of sorcerers who had magical abilities such as inflicting illness and even causing death. So which is it? A hoax to get people's money? Or real supernatural powers? If you want to read the full descriptions, I'll include a link to the droning letters this dude wrote to the Spanish king at the time, available now on the Gutenberg website. The Spanish had two goals when it came to the Filipino people: take their land and make them Christians. But people were living all over these islands. There's so many islands. So what did they do? Resettle them and concentrate them into population centers. This created a new social order. The upper class was made of natives who were educated and large-scale landowners. They renounced their Malayan culture. They welcomed that proximity to whiteness, and they assimilated. Then the next class was less educated, small-scale landowners. At the bottom of the ladder was the laboring class, the poor, the ignorant, the laborers, servants, fishermen. They still retained their culture and were considered fanatical and superstitious. Then there was a massive campaign to provide Catholic education to the natives. Again, saving them from ignorance and demonizing them for being different. This education included teaching them that men and women had different rank and status. Man was a public being. Woman was a private being. So the man was superior and could receive superior education in law, medicine, theology. Women could learn to sew and behave. Cash crop agriculture also employed mostly men. Women saw their importance decline in politics and in the community. Even their religious duties were taken over by male priests from the Catholic Church. In fact, because the Babaylans were the religious leaders of their people, they were the primary target for conversion by the church. Many of them resisted and helped organize revolts against the colonizers. You might remember from episode 4 that virginity was not seen as important in Southeast Asia. Not only that, but in the Philippines, women were the ones to initiate courtship. Well, no more of that nonsense with the Catholics. Premarital sex became a no-no. Women were now subservient to their husbands and would be severely punished for premarital sex or extramarital affairs, but their husbands wouldn't have the same expectations. If you've watched the Barbie movie, this is the part where Ken finds out about the patriarchy and he's like, yes, this sounds great. A husband now had full authority to dispose of his wife's property as if he owned them. Previously, he would not be able to do that. Women had to get their husband's permission to enter even the smallest of contracts. Husbands were allowed to give their wives kicks and blows as they deserved, and daughters were given much smaller inheritance compared to sons. But guess what? This only affected the upper class because they owned land, and they needed to assimilate if they wanted to move up in life. Among the lower classes, the Spaniards wrote that men and women continued to be co-partners true to their cultural values. They shared responsibilities in the home, and both of them worked. The Spanish wrote that the women were more hardworking and economically aggressive, while the men, according to the Spaniards, disliked physical exertion and only worked as little as needed to meet their immediate needs. They were more interested in cockfighting and gambling. It was the women who were supporting the men. They found it scandalous. When the history of pre-colonial times is taught in the Philippines, the Babaylands are barely mentioned, and those of them who were born male have been completely erased. It's only recently that this history is being reclaimed by the Filipino community. Today, the Philippines is 86% Catholic, with another 8% of other Christian denominations. A clever Japanese man once said to a European traveler, "How evil-minded you Europeans are. You come here and witness things we hold as quite natural, and then go and describe what you term our immorality." The first contact between France and Vietnam was through a Jesuit missionary in the 17th century. In the 18th century, the French were still mostly interested in trade. But then in the 19th century, the French colonial empire got involved in order to protect the work of the Paris Foreign Mission Society in Vietnam. So to save the Vietnamese Catholics is basically their argument. Meanwhile, the Nguyen dynasty increasingly saw Catholic missions as a political threat. The courtesans weren't keen on the fact that they insisted on monogamy either. Courtesans had a lot of power, and they knew that these missions weren't good news for them. Soon after France starts its colonial project in 1893, the French army surgeon Jacobus X published a book called L'amour aux colonies. It was translated to English as Untrodden Fields of Anthropology. If you ever needed proof that seemingly neutral things like science can be used to justify oppression, look no further than this abomination of a book. The foreword itself is enough to make this guy a regular on Fox News. He writes, "I have probed the depths of the human hearts of my patients, and too often found them cankered, and, conscious of my intentions, I have illuminated them with the torch of philosophy." The very idea that this dude analyzed and documented the anatomy of peoples around the world, including children, in order to make broad, racist generalizations about them sickens me, as he seems to have been by the people he met. I hope he's burning in hell if there is one. If that sounds harsh, reevaluate in 2 minutes. Mind you, I've reread those sections in the original French to see if the English translators had exaggerated his words. They had not. At the time, this region was called Cochin China, and Annam and Tonkin were 2 regions. He nicknames the Annamites men monkeys because, in his view, the monkey is the animal with the smallest genital organs in proportion to its body, and the monkey is also the only animal which masturbates intentionally. Apparently, the guy has never seen a horny dog hump his leg, but I digress. The English foreword praises how the book examines the civilizations of Annam, Tonkin, and Cambodia so dutifully, quote,
laying open as with a scalpel, and exposing the vices of people who have brought depravity almost up to the level of a fine art.
He writes rather reluctantly that in the early days of the colony at least, quite a few Frenchmen indulged in pederasty, but there was a very good reason. Vietnamese women were repulsive, with black lacquered teeth. So some men preferred sodomy or pederasty. This book is so drenched in racist tropes, I couldn't even make this up if I tried. He goes at length to describe young boys and young men working as prostitutes in Saigon, and as if he's so disgusted even having to write about it, he notes, "What I wish to chiefly note here is the radical difference between the pederasty of the Annamite of the North or South, and also of the Chinese, and that of the European. It is a general characteristic of the Asiatics, who are lewd and devoid of moral restraint, whilst on the contrary, in the European races, it is of an esoteric character, peculiar to certain individuals, mere erotic idiots, whom the bulk of their fellows have always scorned and loathed as they deserve." He did like the Cambodians, though. writing that unlike the Annamites, the Cambodians were not addicted to mouth suction and abhor sodomy, which means that Frenchmen who moved to Cambodia had no choice than to take a native mistress instead of using prostitutes, male or female. This, Mr. X thinks, proves that France did not export pederasty to the colonies. That is the only thing we can agree on, Mr. X. Elsewhere in the book, he emphatically claims the Chinese came to Cochin China centuries before white people got there, but even then, he says, the Chinaman can't be blamed because the Annamite is naturally quite as depraved, if not more so than the Chinaman, and that's saying a good deal. A weekly paper called La Vie Indo-Chinoise, or Indo-Chinese Life, published from 1896 to 1898, is full of cartoons depicting colonial life in Vietnam, and since they were among men, they certainly did not hold back on the sexism, racism, or fetishization of Asian women. They openly fantasize about sexual tourism in Japan. In 1897, the paper published 2 cartoons openly attacking efforts to bring more French women to Tonkin. One of them questioned the morality of women who would sign up for it, implying that they must be the least desirable kind. Another warned that the Vietnamese and Japanese sex workers would riot if French women came to compete with them. It seemed the white man very much enjoyed the demographic imbalance, their power over Asian women, and their contempt for white women who could shake things up in the colonies. I'm going to bring back our co-host in a bit, but before I do that, I just want to say thank you. If you made it this far, I hope these stories give you a lot to think about and start your own nuanced conversation about queerness in Asian cultures. This has been a labor of love, and I would be honored if you would like to show your support. There are many free ways to support the show, and there's also ways to donate at nuancespod.com/support. Writing and researching this series has been so much fun, and I want to share more of my writing going forward. I also have so many stories I couldn't fit in those episodes because, as you can tell, I've done a lot of research, and unfortunately, I couldn't fit everything in. So I will be sharing bonus mini episodes on my Substack. You can subscribe to it at lazou.substack.com, lazou.substack.com. I'll put a link in the show notes. And I will share occasional essays, behind-the-scene updates from the studio, and those bonus episodes once in a while. I've also gotten requests to share more about my music, so I might include some of that too. It's free to subscribe, but you can become a paid member for $5 a month or $50 a year if you enjoy my work and would like to help sustain it. Either way, I am super grateful for you. Thank you for being here. All right, let's get back to our co-host. so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
I sent you this script that is very long. What went through your mind going through this? As somebody with a background with anthropology, I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts.
One of the fascinating classes I took in undergrad was about ancient law, essentially. And it's really interesting to see the ways in which humanity has used like codified legal systems to control society and to look at how they have a civilizing influence, right? And so it is fascinating to look at the way in which we codify morals or values in a way that is unnecessary. Like you would think that society just has values that are collectively shared, but there's really this sense of control that comes with law. The way that we have used it to control the populace is fascinating, but it's also horrifying because you look at these laws and you're like, these are very unreasonable. This was very clearly a way to directly impact or harm a certain community of people without saying explicitly who this was directed towards.
Yeah. Some of it was like the Criminal Tribes Act, but all the others, not so much. Going through that Human Rights Watch report about Section 377, I was like, wow, this tiny island has done so much harm around the globe.
Right. And it's hard because on the one hand, they're not the only colonizing or imperialistic force that's existed, right? But they were so good at it. And I think the merging of capitalism with this imperialistic force has really like gone global. It really changed a lot of the ways people thought about conquest.
Yeah, I wanted to make that point in the scripts. Like, they didn't invent colonialism, they didn't invent oppression, but they might have perfected it.
Got it down to a science, man.
Yeah, that was impressive in a very bad way.
I think it's also interesting to note that even countries that have never been colonized by the West still feel the impact of Western imperialism. And now with the internet and globalization, you don't have to have been conquered by the West to feel the impact of Western imperialism.
Yeah. Reading through the history with China and how the defeat brought shame to the country, and then how Japan looked at that and they're like, oh, we don't want to be them, so we better catch up with the white people and show them that we're modern, we're civilized. You don't have to come here and colonize us. We can do all the things you can do. We can go oppress other people.
We can even do a better job than you guys did.
We can beat up the Russians.
Korea was caught in the middle of that war, right? Between Japan and Russia, which had massive consequences for Korea. And so, yes, this idea of this massive colonizing force on its way, how will we respond?
Yeah.
But I was going to say, for you, as you're going through this material, what kind of themes did you see come up over and over again?
The main thing that struck me was how many different countries looked at the West as what it was, an imperial power trying to control people. They were like, we can't let that happen here. We got to figure something out. And they all went pretty much the same way. A lot of times it's the elite, the people who want to maintain their autonomy, but their status also, and their national pride in a way, right? A lot of times these were the people who were educated in the West. So they brought those ideas back. And again, it's not like some of them didn't really buy into it. Like a lot of them definitely bought into it, right? They went to the West and said, oh, this is so much better. There's this idea of democracy. So, you know, it wasn't all bad ideas, but in terms of implementation, there was a lot of really bad things that happened.
It's funny you mentioned democracy because they're a monarchy, right? It's just, the West is full of monarchies. And during this entire time period, it was just one king or queen after another conquering lands that didn't belong to them. But one thing that I've always appreciated, that when people point out, like when you see these wars, when you see these genocides, you see these conquests, it's never actually about the hatred that you think it is. It's almost always manufactured hatred in order to justify the grab for land or wealth or resources. Yeah. And so it's really interesting and also devastating. Like, it's sad to see that they spread this manufactured hatred towards common people. They teach the common people, the populace, to hate this group, to other this group in order to justify the elitist grab for resources. That's always, it's always land, money, power.
Yeah. It's so easy to get people to hate other people they don't know, right? Like, it's just so easy to spread those lies, especially in a pre-internet time, you know? It's so easy for somebody to say, oh, those people, they're dangerous. They want to kill you. Kill them before they kill you.
Yeah. Because even now
don't-
in the age of the internet, I don't want to get too political, but we have presidential candidates saying things like they're not sending over their best. And you just think, what are you trying to imply, sir?
Yeah, the white men in Vietnam were like, don't send the women here. You're just going to send the bad ones. We don't want them. This kind of thinking has been around for a long time.
Yeah. Also interesting to see the ways in which the homophobia and transphobia that we're talking about in today's episode, that it'll dovetail in with other concepts that are already existing in a culture sometimes. Like I'm thinking about Korea with Confucianism. Korea was a Confucian country for a really long time, and that was this massive part of the values and ideals. Confucianism is pretty misogynistic. Like that's just how it shakes out, right? So when you have Western missionaries come over and say this is civilizing, this is what God wants, and they're also incredibly misogynistic, those things just link up, and it's, oh, well, yes, of course, this already fits part of my worldview, so it's so much easier to accept. I wonder how difficult it was for homophobia or transphobia to enter into places that didn't already have some sort of sense of this is wicked, this is wrong, this is unacceptable.
Yeah, it was definitely forced on the Philippines, right? The Spanish had this list of all the different types of witches and supposedly the powers that they have, but then there are also hoaxes that don't really do anything, just take people's money. So I'm like, which is it though?
Which, like, you got to pick a struggle, man.
One thing you mentioned about the missionaries and Confucianism in China, for example, the missions that were there were actually more progressive and trying to push for female education because this was part of the colonial project, right? So they contradict themselves so much, oppressing people back in their home country. They're in the new country saying, oh no, we are liberating people.
You're like, women can't inherit land, but they have to know God's word.
And if you think about it, that's exactly what America's doing right now.
Right,
it's oppressing trans kids, people, like, and then we're looking at all the quote unquote backward countries and being like, we have gay rights, we have gay marriage. You don't have them. You're backwards.
And it's so frustrating. You're like, who do you think some of these countries learned these values from? Who do you think they got homophobia from? And in so many of these cultures, multiple genders was a concept that was very accepted and often in a spiritual sense too, right? There was this idea that there was a spirit within them that was different and accepted, and that there was a position and a role for them in both society and in religious traditions. And now with the incoming of Christianity and Western Christianity specifically, there was this idea like, oh, well, that doesn't exist anymore. Well, what do you want us to do with them? And we turned it into that individual is cursed, is improper, they're lewd, right? And we've turned them into something perverse when before that was something completely natural. It was totally understood and accepted. We've taken this large societal concept and created a law to essentially like point out individuals to say, oh, well, they're sinful, they're wicked. It's an individual sin on their parts. What a trip.
I often wonder if some of those horrible things that we do as humans is as a result of being able to become a body that's too large in terms of the numbers of people. I read somewhere that religion started when human tribes became over a certain size. I often wonder if all of those laws that we come up with that are so oppressive are because we're trying to control too many people at the same time.
Right. In a really small community where you know everybody and you have a connection to most people in the community, it is harder, I think, to be cruel towards people. And it's also, if the rest of the community has decided, well, you're just being a cruel person, it's almost easier to protect one another against a specific person's cruelty if everyone else in the community is like, hey, that's not how we treat each other. But when you start getting these really big tribes, cities, countries, massive corporations, people become a faceless horde. They're just a faceless mass, and it becomes so easy to create scapegoats or to other. It becomes so easy to take advantage because you're not seeing the real life impact. You're not having to go to somebody's face and steal from them, but it's easy to garnish wages, when you're a CEO, right?
A lot of the guests I've had who came from a very small town, a place that you would think people are very racist, a lot of them said the community was, they had racist stereotypes, but they were always nice. They didn't explicitly be like, oh, Stella, you're Asian. We don't like you, And I wonder if it's to divide and conquer, you need a large enough number to divide. And if it's small enough, then you can't divide them. So you can't.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. It becomes so much harder to other somebody that you are in community with. If you're consistently meeting and you see them as a person, it's almost impossible to dehumanize. I mean, it is possible. Homophobes and transphobes are capable of a lot of mental gymnastics, but it is much harder to dehumanize somebody that you see as a person. Right. And I think, I'm looking at the vagrancy laws here, and it's really interesting how they are creating an other, essentially out of something so simple as loitering. Somebody just hanging around. What problem of society are they trying to solve by not allowing people to just hang out?
Yeah. The problem is rich people don't want to see poor people on the street.
We could solve that by solving poverty rather than just shoving people who are unhoused and homeless to the out fringes of society. Like, we can just not have poor people anymore by not having poor people.
Yeah. It's so frustrating. It's still happening today in California.
Right. I know people are like the liberal bastion of the West. No. We have massive problems with, NIMBY, right? Not in my backyard.
Yeah.
And again, it's so frustrating because you're like, poverty is due to policies. This is a choice on the part of policymakers, on the part of corporations to keep people in these spaces.
What did you think about the untrodden fields of anthropology? As an anthropologist.
Oh man, the field that I chose as a very young person decades ago, I didn't realize at the time how incredibly racist it was. It's been so long since I've done any anthropology, but I know that there are many people trying to redeem it. They're trying to find a way to make it less racist, but it's incredibly challenging. Can it be redeemed?
Growing up in Mauritius, I had never heard of anthropology as a field of study because I had very few options available. Math, physics, chemistry, biology, accounting, very few options were available. So the first time I heard about anthropology was when I went to college, and there were a few people who were majoring in it. I still don't understand what anthropology is. When you went into anthropology, what was your understanding of this field is?
I think a lot of people think of anthropology and they think of archaeology, like you're going to go to some ancient place. And on the one hand, yes, but I often tell people that anthropology is really trying to get at what is universal to man. What is universal about how mankind functions? And the way that anthropology wants to discover the origins of man and the universality of what makes us human is by trying to strip away, in their minds, culture, civilization. They're trying to get back to, like, how did we become what we are? It's a very Western perception of what makes us humans, right? If you were to strip away everything that is different about us from each other, what do we have in common? What makes us people? And so that's really, in my mind, what I was trying to study as I studied cultural anthropology. I had a really big interest at the time in what makes us different from one another, what makes us the same. One of the most interesting classes was child development, but from the perspective of multiple cultures. So it's looking at how humans develop over their lifetime, but not only from the perspective of the West. We looked at the West, East Asia, the Swana region, Southwest Asia, North Africa. How have we historically and now currently think about ways people develop? Sadly, it is a really racist feel. As I was looking at the excerpt from the Untrodden Fields of Anthropology, I just remember this quote that I've seen, which is that a racist society can only give rise to a racist science. Right? We think science is empirical evidence, right? We think it's so neutral. I think it's actually one of our downfalls as a society to believe that science is perfectly neutral when people are performing the science. And we have biases. Everyone's, well, like you have to go with the data. I don't know if these people have read the science papers, but sometimes you're like, no, that was a clear bias. And now with corporations, like just buying science papers and paying scientists to do research, you're like, yeah, no, there's a lot of bias there.
Yeah, I remember in high school, I was taking a computing class. We were talking about there's a difference between data and information. Data is just numbers. Information is how you make sense of those numbers. Data might be neutral, but the information that you infer from that data, definitely not neutral.
We as humans put facts into context. A fact is just a thing. What is the constellation we've created out of these data points? What is the image we're seeing? As we put these data points into context, it creates a picture. And just like a constellation, sometimes other people look at that and they're like, no, that is not a bear. I'm sorry. I don't know where you got that from. It's so human of us to want to make it narrative.
Yeah, it's possible to look at numbers and present it at an angle that fits your narrative. So for example, a few years ago when Black Lives Matter was happening, I had a very angry phone call from somebody that I am no longer talking to. Their argument was, well, police kill more white people than Black people every year. They got that from Statista. And I'm like, but there's way more white people though. If you look at percentages, you know what I mean? If you want to just find something that corroborates what you believe, which is there's no discrimination here. He just happened to be Black. I'm like, dude, so you have the data. The data is the number of people killed by police, their demographics. That's the neutral fact, right? But then how do you interpret that information? Well, if you want to say that it wasn't race motivated or race influenced, you want to look at the raw numbers because that fits your narrative. But if you want to look at it from a systemic point of view, like proportionally, is it the same? It's definitely not the same proportionally.
Right.
Right. So it's so easy to find a perspective that corroborates your point of view. Whose point of view is the most neutral is the question.
And it's such a tough one. I think that's like the bastion of white men, right? Where they're like, well, I'm an outsider to the situation. So obviously I'm the most universally neutral. And it's no.
No.
I mean, it's still happening, right? When we look at laws today. So they're trying to pass laws for people who have preyed on children, right? Whatever they consider to be harm to a child. They would like to do things like the death penalty, life in prison. They're saying like, well, this is to target all the pedophiles. This is to target the people that would hurt kids. And you just think, no, you guys are going to use this to target trans people and queer people. And you're going to say, oh, well, they're drag queens. So obviously, even though children are not allowed at their shows, they must be the problem.
Yeah. And again, it's similar to that vagrancy law, right? You don't even have to have proof that anything even happened. They just look like the kind.
Yes. Or stop and frisk laws. In New York, that was a huge thing. And they didn't have to have any evidence of a crime. If police just thought you looked shady. And again, that law completely disproportionately targeted Black and brown people.
Yep. So Fields of Anthropology, not a great book.
Amazing that you read it.
I didn't read the whole thing. I read the chapter that was about Asia, and I did look at the French and the English for some bits. I'm like, did the English translation make this worse? I wanted to go to the source. No, the source is just as bad.
We love that you were able to read it in both French and English.
I know. It's too bad I don't speak Spanish because I could have read the stuff for the Philippines too. But the translation of those letters. First of all, this dude is sending letters that are like books to this king. Is the king even reading this stuff? I mean, it's so
Of course
long.
not.
on and on and on and on. It's so repetitive. It's so tedious to even read. I bet the king didn't even read it and was just like, do whatever he says.
Pass to an advisor.
Oh my God.
How like a monarchy to hand off the hard labor to somebody else. I did have a question though, as I was reading through this material. I was looking at all these laws, like the vagrancy laws. I was looking at the impact of the opium wars. What benefit do you think it had to create these laws targeting these people? Why would you target queer or trans folks? What benefit was this for?
I think that's where capitalism, colonialism, and Christianity come together, because they were using the quote unquote Christian values to impose their idea of morality as an excuse to be like, we need to be here to save your soul and civilize you. We're doing you a favor. And by the way, we want all the stuff that your country has and, you know, the free labor and all of that. But we're really here for you.
God wants us to do this.
So, like the French, their excuse to get involved in a lot of those things was, well, the Catholic missions are in trouble because the locals or whoever is attacking the Catholic priests or the Catholic converts. So we got to go save them. That's why they went into Vietnam. And that's why they joined Britain against the Chinese. So for the French, a lot of times it was really about Jesus, but also the land, but Jesus, you know? Same with the Spanish. So I think in that sense, the religion was the excuse. That was the cover, right? But then imperialists gonna imperialize. But for the British, I think it was also puritanical Christianity, but I don't think they used it as much as the French in terms of a cover.
We would like all the spices, please. Then they don't even use them now. What was all for? I read once that it's because average, regular, degular people were gaining access to so many different spices, so many different flavors. And the elite were like, well, it's become too passe. Now we're going to appreciate the raw ingredient for what it is.
Really?
And it's, so you just really want a boiled potato. Cool. Cool. Potatoes aren't even from Europe. Those crops are all from the Americas, guys.
Yeah. They did love their tea, though. I mean, how many battles have been about tea for the British?
China had an amazing product on their hands, and the Brits were like, oh, God, we got to have this for ourselves. It's so funny that the UK genuinely thinks like they are the origin of tea culture. I'm like, have you guys ever, I don't know, been to Asia? Perhaps where tea originated in China? And the fact that they took over India because they didn't want to pay China anymore for tea.
Well, they didn't take over India for that reason, but it definitely helped their agenda to not have to pay them silver anymore.
Anything to not pay prices. Again, how like a monarchy.
Yeah. Like capitalism, like
Man.
Market forces. I wonder what we can create demand for. Ooh, opium.
And it's ridiculous because the Bible, their holy book, literally says that money is the root of all evil. And here they are colonizing people saying, you all have to read this. This is for your souls. Did you read this? Have you perhaps seen the text here? No?
You have to laugh about it to not cry about it.
100%.
Yeah. If you're comfortable sharing, I'd like to hear a bit more about your experience as a queer Asian woman, what that has been like for you as a young person and even navigating now.
Yeah, I mean, I think in my case, being a queer person, but more specifically being bi and being demisexual has been a journey. I occupy liminal space in queer culture in some ways because I got married at 22 to a man who I'm still very happily married to. And I didn't realize at the time that I was queer. And in fact, I was at a very conservative, very evangelical church for all of my college years, up until my early young adult years, probably until we had our first kid. And so for me, I was just like, well, you know how people will say like, everybody's a little bisexual. It's not true. Everybody is not, in fact, a little bisexual. If you think that maybe everybody's a little bisexual, you might need to look at, right? Like, The closet is made of glass, my friend. But I didn't realize that I was queer for a long time. And as I came to the understanding of it, I was like, oh no, like what in my life is going to have to change? And I remember talking to my husband about it, and he was like, well, what kind of changes do you want to make? And so we had a lot of really open conversations about it. This was after I had already left the church. When I came out, so many people I knew from back in college were essentially panicking in my DMs. They were like, are you getting a divorce? Are you going to? I was like, no, I just want people to know queer people, queer women exist. And because I'm bi, some of us are in relationships with men, but I'm not any less bi.
Yeah.
But this really upset people. They were like, as long as you're staying married, I guess it's not sinful. I was like, I don't understand why this is so difficult for you. Being bisexual in and of itself is not sin. If I was out here assaulting people, that would be sinful. But a consensual adult relationship is not going to be under the sin umbrella, my friends, regardless of who it's with, right? I remember it was so upsetting to people. And my parents still don't really believe. Functionally for them, I am a straight person. So no matter how many times I've tried to bring it up, my parents are like, that is invisible to us. And I get it. For a lot of Asian parents, your sexuality is only visible to them when you're doing things like marrying somebody of the same gender. Or if you're trans and you've come out and you're transitioning, that's when it's real. But before then, it doesn't matter. And so for a lot of people in my life, they're like, oh, well, is she really gay? Yes, I am actually a queer person. But I don't experience a lot of homophobia the same way that my friends who are lesbians, my friends who are gay men, my friends who are in like trans relationships, they experience homophobia in a very different way than I do. And I think I try to be really conscious of the way that I do exist in this liminal space where I do appear to be cishet. I do appear to be in a cishet marriage. And I think that actually gives me a little more leeway to be vocal, to be open, and to tell people, hey, you can be queer and look a lot of different ways. There isn't one way to be a queer person, a queer Asian American. And I think that's really important. I think it's important for people to understand that there are so many diverse ways to be out and about. Yeah. It has been very strange to be in this liminal space. I ask myself a lot, do I count? Or I did earlier in my journey, but I've met so many queer people who are like, of course you count. Of course. And I think if you're online a lot and you don't have a lot of queer community in person, you see a lot of discourse. You see a lot of, oh, but do bisexual people really count? Do asexual, aromantic, demisexual people, are they really a part of the community? And you see a lot of TERF, a lot of queer people who are TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists. You'll see a lot of that online, but in person, so often queer community is just about hanging out. Queer people go out to museums and they go out to bars and they play board games. They go bowling, surfing, and they're just regular people.
They get good grades, they become accountants, they become engineers and doctors.
And so it's like they run the gamut. And I think meeting queer community in person, getting to know people and love them as humans has really helped me be so content in my own queer identity.
How did you realize that you were queer?
This is probably before I had my oldest, so maybe like 15, 16 years ago now. I read a thing on Tumblr about being demisexual. I never really crushed on people when I was in high school or even in college. For a lot of women, especially growing up in the 90s, lots of boy bands and teen heartthrobs. I was like, Angelina Jolie is right there. How did I not know I was gay? But I don't recall having extreme feelings of attraction or interest in, celebrities or even in like regular people, right? And so people were like, how did you end up with your husband? I was just like, it was a pretty slow process. We were friends for a year and realized we fit well together. And that's when I became more attracted to him. And so I was like, oh my gosh, demisexuality is a sexual orientation where you experience attraction after you have a pretty tight emotional relationship with somebody. So there isn't this like insta lust or like love at first sight feeling. And I'm like, I've never had that. And it's funny, people will say, isn't that everybody? And I'm like, again, friend, if you think everybody is demisexual, you might need to look into that. But that was my pathway into it. And as time went on, I was like, oh, know. I'm kind of, if people were like, how do you identify more specifically as opposed to just queer? I would say demisexual or gray sexual, but also bisexual. I realized like, oh no, I would very easily be attracted to a woman or non-binary person. I'm not really limited by gender in who I form attachments and attractions with. People do ask like, oh, so does this mean you have an open marriage? That's always the question people have, right? And I'm like, that's just so interesting. Like, we don't ask straight people this question. And I think there is a lot of this mentality of looking at queer people and queer relationships as inherently deviant. But no, it's no. But we did talk about it. And that's one thing that I do appreciate about the queer people in my life is that they do have these conversations really openly, really clearly. Is this an open or closed relationship? Are we polyamorous? Are we monogamous? And I think for my husband and I, we both just decided we're he's very monogamous by nature. For me, I am less so, but also I'm really tired. I'm like, I don't have the capacity to connect with more people right now. And he's like, well, if that changes, like, let me know. I've met a lot of queer people in relationships with a straight partner. And some of them are like, yeah, it's open and it's been really great for both of us. And other people are like, no, like we're closed and we're very content. And so I think that's interesting. I think it's kind of neat.
Okay, so this is hilarious. But as we're talking about this, I am wondering if I might be demisexual.
That was really my entryway into understanding my queer identity. And as an Asian American, I started wondering about my gender identity too. You and I talked about this before, maybe, but I realized so much of gender is centered in the West on white cishet norms. As an Asian American woman, I cannot fit into those norms. My relationship with womanhood was always tenuous. Am I really a woman? And I realized, no, I don't feel like white women feel about their womanhood. So much of gender constructs in the West are completely centered on womanhood being the way white women envision themselves and the way that white men envision white women. The beauty standards, the narrative journey, the interiority of how women think about themselves. I've been pregnant 3 times. I've had 3 children. I have never had a glamorous earth mother experience with maternity. When I was pregnant, I was like, this is the most hostile my body has ever felt. I don't feel comfortable at all. And so I was like, am I not a woman then? Am I not? And meeting more queer people of color specifically, and meeting trans people of color helped me realize like, oh, our experiences of womanhood, especially as Asian Americans, we have our home culture and the broader culture. I don't fit into the white woman standard, obviously. I don't fit into Korean American standards though for women either. Like as a woman who is 5'8", I'm not going to fit into what white people think Asian women should look like or act like. And I don't fit into what Korean people think Korean women should look like or act like. And so it made it really hard for me because I was like, I don't fit into any of this. That doesn't mean I'm not a woman. My experience of womanhood can't fit into these boxes that people have. Do I think of myself as more of a person than a woman, more of a man than a woman? It took me like 3 years of digging into this, of thinking about how being petite, being feminine, being dainty, like literally none of those things really fit.
I had the same experience in terms of womanhood in Asian and white environments. I didn't question whether I was a woman. I just was very aware that I didn't fit either beauty standard. I'm like, it's fine. I'll be ugly. I'm smart though.
I don't exist here to be hot for other people, okay? That's what I told myself as I was getting older. I was like, I don't exist to be hot for other people. It's fine.
Yeah. And I'm like, we're all going to get ugly, but I'm still going to be smart, so it's fine.
Hey, listen, you're not ugly, you're just broke. Because it's really easy to fix an ugly face. It is not easy to fix an ugly personality. We came out on top here, right? We came out on top. But isn't it fascinating how interrogating things like your gender identity, sexuality, really forces you to pull apart all of these strands of white normativity, cishet normativity, all of these things that I would not have questioned if I hadn't interrogated myself about who I am and where I am standing.
Yeah. As you were talking about how people in the church reacted and how they immediately associate queerness with promiscuity and how they associate same-sex relations as inherently sinful, all of those go back to those laws, right?
Yes.
Because those laws purposely did not include consent when it came to same-sex relations. And if you were caught being a sodomite or looked like one, that was the same as being caught for being a rapist or being a child abuser. So they forced those to be in the same category, which then cemented this perception that queer people are evil, right?
Right, that they're predators, they're inherently
Yeah.
dangerous to society. And it is really fascinating to think about how these weren't really identities before. Your sexuality was not an identity before. You had sex with people you felt like having sex with. Sometimes men, sometimes women. Some were particular about one or the other. These laws turning people into deviants almost cemented this as an identity, which is ironic.
You know, China had laws that they were never explicitly about same-sex relations. They had laws against rape. And if you rape somebody, it didn't matter if it was same-sex or different sex. Rape is rape, which is the way it should be.
Yes.
That's the only thing the law should punish, not consensual.
So close, and yet so far.
It's like you didn't get the categories right. You didn't pass the sorting. You know, the child's game that they have to put the star in the star box and they have to put the triangle in the triangle hole. Yeah, y'all didn't do that.
Right? And it's wild because it's like, there are not as many of you as you think there are, my friends. I'm not saying cishet people are the minority, but I'm saying there are a lot more of us who are trans, non-binary, queer, intersex. Yeah. That's the other thing. I feel like intersex people often get caught up into this transphobia, and they're literally cis people who are intersex. And many of us may be intersex and not know, because most of us do not get genetic testing unless a health issue crops up. So you wouldn't know what your chromosomes are. We just assume. Yeah. And like the Olympics kerfluffle with.
Yeah, that really reminded me of the inspections mentioned in these laws. Oh, you look like you might be a sodomite. We're going to inspect your genitals. It's like, ew.
It's a little invasive, no?
And also, you want to see my butt. You're the one who's weird here.
You're the weird one. That is not. It's very strange. Very strange. Yeah. It's fascinating how homophobia and transphobia cause all common sense to go right out the window.
And again, demonizing works. As much as modern life has brought conveniences and human rights for many of us, they also demonize so many of us, hence the episode.
Yes, othering is an incredibly effective tactic, right? The scapegoating.
All right. Before we close out, what do you hope people get out of this episode or out of this series?
I think out of the series in particular, I hope that people see that we've always existed. We've always been here. And there have always been societal perceptions about us. Sometimes for good, sometimes for awful. Sometimes some of us have this desire to go back to the way things were. We think, well, if colonization had never happened, and there's this mentality that things were purer before. Yeah, and as an anthropologist, I can say, no, that's not true. Awful people have existed in every society, and in any marginalized community you find, there will be awful people in it, but there will also be really great people. The thing that will keep us safest is not trying to get back to how things were, but to think about what have we learned from them? What themes, what lessons can we glean, and what can we do moving forward to keep protecting all of us? Because transphobia, homophobia, this kind of bigotry impacts everybody. People who are not in these categories at all will be tossed in anyway.
Yeah.
Any of these laws can be used to harm anybody, and they will eventually come for all of us. Protecting the most marginalized among us and realizing that those people had a place in society, they had roles, they were important and vital to communities, and that we can create that once again in an even better way, I think would be a wonderful way to move forward.
I would like to thank our scholars for today, Professor Anjali Arondekar, Professor of Feminist Studies and South Asian Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and Professor CunCun Wu, Professor of Chinese Literature at the University of Hong Kong. Also, a big thank you to our co-host of the day, Stella, for being here on the show. I will have Stella's bio and links in the show notes if you want to get in touch with her. This episode was so long that I had to split it into 2 parts, so I hope you will come back next time for part 2. Until then, my name is Lazu. I'll see you soon for another nuanced conversation.